Outlaw stories love to promise us a kind of immortal toughness. The idea that a true desperado can be riddled with bullets and still stagger off into the sunset, too stubborn to die, too crafty to need a doctor. But there's a much darker reality beneath that myth. The sheer, messy, physical horror of actually being shot and left to bleed out in the back seat of a getaway car, with nothing between you and death but a blanket, a desperate spouse, and maybe a scrap of hope. The real question isn't how tough the outlaw legend makes you, it's what actually happens to your body, hour by hour, when all the medical help you get is whatever your terrified partner can improvise, and no amount of grit is enough to stop the blood from leaving your veins. At the movies, or in the more breathless press accounts, these men are made out to be nearly indestructible. Popular film and early news stories, sometimes even FBI statements, have long portrayed outlaws like Nelson as able to shake off gunshot wounds with grim determination and a little luck. In these retellings, a bullet is an obstacle, but never the end. A hero's body can take punishment no regular person could survive, as long as the legend holds out. This image is so durable that it lingers in our collective imagination, as if outlaw medicine is just a matter of willpower and maybe a handy strip of torn shirt. But the facts of Nelson's last hours are far less forgiving. On the 27th of November, 1934, in the infamous Barrington shootout, Babyface Nelson was mortally wounded. This isn't Hollywood drama or exaggerated legend. Contemporary reports and later biographers agree. He took multiple gunshot wounds, at least one of which tore through his abdomen and another that struck his legs. He was alive, just barely, but losing blood fast, and every mile the car put between him and the gunfight only increased the urgency. The story isn't about whether he made a daring escape. It's about what, if anything, could actually be done for a dying man with nothing but the meager supplies in an outlaw's car. Here's what's clear. There were no doctors waiting, no medical bags, no trained hands. The only people in the getaway car were Nelson himself, his wife Helen, and John Paul Chase. No medical professional was present. They fled the scene with a mortally wounded Nelson, just 3 outlaws huddled in a cold car heading into the unknown. The limits of their resources were absolute. There would be no hospital, no morphine, and no clean dressings. Whatever happened next depended entirely on what Helen and Chase could manage on the fly, with nothing but a blanket and whatever courage or panic they could muster. That sets up the real grisly question. With death closing in, what could they actually do for his wounds? In the chaos after the shootout, the only documented treatment for Nelson's gunshot wounds was brutally simple. Helen and Chase wrapped him in a blanket, trying to hold his ruined body together, to slow the bleeding, to do something, anything, with the meager supplies at hand. There was no first aid kit, no antiseptic, nothing but a car seat and a thick blanket soaked in fear and blood. That was it. The blanket became his bandage, his splint, his last shroud. There's no credible evidence of even a basic tourniquet or pressure dressing. The infamous Babyface Nelson, with so many crimes and so many enemies, was reduced to the kind of care you'd give a wounded dog at the side of the road. It's not hard to picture what likely happened next, given the desperation and the era. There's no direct record of Helen's every move, but it's plausible. Based on what we know of roadside medicine and panic, that she frantically pressed rags and pieces of the blanket against the worst wounds, maybe stuffing folds of fabric into holes that wouldn't stop leaking blood. Every jolt in the road would have sent new waves of agony through Nelson's body, his blood soaking into the cloth and pooling beneath him in the back seat. Helen's hands would have been slippery, shaking, with no way to stop the blood or fight infection. All she could do was press harder and hope he'd hang on long enough to make it somewhere, anywhere, safer. But even these desperate efforts barely slowed the inevitable. The bleeding did not stop. Nelson continued to hemorrhage for hours as they drove, with the wrappings, blanket, rags, whatever they could grab, soaked through by the time they found even temporary shelter. Blood loss at that level isn't just dramatic, it's fatal. The car itself became a mobile sick room, a grim trail of evidence marking Nelson's fading strength. By the end, the fabric meant to save him was just one more thing ruined by his wounds, heavy with the proof that survival was out of reach. There was nothing remotely medical about the environment. No painkillers, no sterile dressings, no alcohol or iodine, just dirty cloth, a freezing car, and the smell of blood and sweat turning sour in the November cold. It's overwhelmingly likely that the only supplies were whatever rags or clothing Helen could find, improvised on the spot, with no way to clean or properly wrap the wounds. Nelson's body lay twisted on the back seat, shivering, sticky, exposed to infection, shock, and relentless pain. In the end, outlaw medicine wasn't medicine at all. It was flannel, hope, and the cruel, drawn-out certainty that nothing was going to work. Even after the frantic drive away from the shootout, no one in the car had medical supplies or training. In that desperate situation, Helen and the others likely did whatever they could just to keep Nelson alive a little longer. That would mean bundling him tighter in whatever blankets or coats they could find, desperately trying to keep him warm as he shivered and faded. There was probably an urgent, panicked effort to keep him conscious, talking to him, nudging him if he drifted, checking to make sure he was still breathing. But these were not treatments. They were the bare survival instincts of people out of options, fighting off the knowledge that nothing they did would actually help. The reality behind these frantic measures was grim. Nothing they did, not the wrapping, not the makeshift attempts to stanch the bleeding, not the constant vigilance, could actually address the real problem. The wounds Nelson suffered were fatal regardless of any improvised care. Every minute bought with a blanket or a reassuring word simply drew out the agony. There was no medical professional in the car, no pain relief, no way to properly stem the blood flow or fight infection. The best they could do only slowed the decline, prolonging the misery and giving a longer, closer look at just how little separated desperate hope from certain death. You can imagine what that felt like, trapped in that freezing car, the air thick with the smell of blood and sweat, skin slick and sticky from the wounds that kept leaking warmth and life, pain everywhere, a gnawing, sharp ache that never let up, only dulled by exhaustion. Cold cutting in, no matter how tightly the blankets were pulled. Fear, not just for himself, but for Helen, for the others, for what would happen next. The fatigue would be overwhelming. Every movement a struggle, each breath a little more labored than the last. Those final hours were a grim parade of pain, cold, fear, and the slow collapse of the body's defenses. Nelson died within hours, right there in the car, wrapped in blankets and rags, surrounded by the people who tried everything they could think of but still could not save him. The causes, blood loss, untreated infection risk, and shock, things that no amount of makeshift care could hope to fix in those conditions. Nothing about the scene offered even the faintest chance at real survival. The story of outlaw medicine closes here: flannel, desperation, and failure, because the truth is, death was always just behind the wheel. Attributed to both contemporary press and decades of Hollywood films, Babyface Nelson's final hours have often been rewritten to fit a cleaner, more heroic script. Newspaper stories at the time leaned into the image of the unbreakable outlaw, skipping over the physical breakdown and constant agony, sometimes describing his courage or making his death sound almost peaceful or defiant. Later movies and novels only doubled down, scrubbing away the worst of the suffering and swapping desperate, failed care for scenes of tough guy stoicism or stoic silence. The reality: freezing blood, failed first aid, hours of unspeakable pain, rarely made it to the screen or the legend. That's not just creative license, it's a collective forgetting, a way to make the end of an outlaw's story less ugly, less humiliating, and above all, less real. State as interpretive conclusion. Avoid overclaiming specifics. If there's one thing Nelson's final hours make clear, it's that so-called outlaw medicine, all the frantic rapping, the desperate hope, the flannel and the makeshift care, was not a ticket to survival. The best anyone could offer in that car was to try to slow the bleeding and keep him conscious a little longer. Supported by the direct fact of Nelson's rapid death and the absence of any documented recovery, it is reasonable to conclude that improvised first aid could only delay the inevitable, not change it. The myth of the criminal so tough he outlasted his wounds, of flannel and grit standing in for a doctor, just erases the real outcome: agony, infection, risk, and a body that couldn't be willed back from the brink. The legend is all drama and defiance. The evidence is all pain and futility. No amount of improvisation, no mythic willpower could have overruled what was happening inside Nelson's body. Once the bullets found their mark, the limits were set by shock, by blood loss, by the cold, by infection, and by the simple absence of anything close to real medical care. Outlaw medicine was not medicine at all. It was a holding pattern, a way to keep moving while the clock ran out. There's no toughness in that, only the reality that legends get built on top of pain, not in place of it. Strip away the Hollywood glow, and the myth doesn't stand up. Outlaw medicine was never about miraculous survival or beating the odds. It was about drawing out the defeat, wrapping it in blankets, shivering in pain, and counting down the hours. In the end, there's no glamour, no escape, just the truth, agony behind the legend, and the body's limits waiting at the finish line.